Good. If you did not know, this session is being recorded. The microphone won't amplify any sound, but it's being recorded over to the side. So it'll look a little odd, especially with us passing the microphone back and forth, but know that it's being recorded so that our friends who aren't at CHO or maybe went to a different session are able to listen to this later. But that's why we have a microphone, but why you can't hear me any differently. So wonderful. So welcome to using a mixed methods approach to developing inclusive communities.
Today we'll focus a little bit talking about how we got to doing this study and kind of giving you a historical background and kind of what was happening on our campus and how we utilize assessment to really like rethink and relook at some of the practices that we have within our housing processes and training and educational opportunities that we provide for our students. So my name is Curtis Jackson Jr. I go by CJ, so I'm amongst friends, so please call me CJ. And I am an assistant director for East Campus at NC State.
And I am Meghan Luzader. I'm assistant director at NC State. I oversee university apartments. I use she, her, hers pronouns. I've been in my position about a year and a half, and CJ has been in his for about, how long have you been? Fifth year. So the historical perspective ranges, but this presentation has been several years in the making, so we're really excited to get to share it with you all. So for the sake of also being mindful of it being audio recorded, we do want to just briefly share the learning outcomes so that those who hear this later can know what our learning outcomes for today are. So being able to analyze mixed methods approach to assessing community engagement. I told CJ, I was like, this is probably the least sexy programming title I've ever come up with, but it is, I think, a true reflection of the work that we did. And so talking a little bit about the role that mixed methods assessment plays on our campus and what it does for highlighting our story as a department and the stories that our students are bringing. Being able to evaluate factors of underrepresented students' willingness to engage in a community. So really looking at, right, our bread and butter is supposed to be community building and community engagement, and trying to get a better sense of why students of minoritized identities are not interested or are not willing to engage in those spaces. And so as you all are thinking and listening to what we talk about for our experience of thinking about the voices that are not present on your own campuses and trying to get an understanding as to why. And then being able to critique data-driven decisions to improve community engagement in a residential setting. So we talk about the importance of data, we talk about the importance of assessment, but also trying to better understand the role that our students play in that it's not just within the housing bubble that we use data, but understanding our students as more than just the number. So thinking about that today as well.
So how we got here, a couple of years ago, we did a sense of community survey at our institution. I believe the survey is offered through Akuhoai, and so we did a sense of community survey to gauge our residents' attitudes about their community that they were living in, to hopefully help us improve the training that we offer, look at our policies that we offer at the institution as well, and different things of that nature. For an historical standpoint, one of the things that's important to mention is kind of like the climate of the university that was going on around that time. So a couple of years ago, and this stuff kind of happens on probably everybody's campus, but NC State had a series of bias incident kind of behaviors or things that were going on campus, right? That were really our residents were feeling charged about. It was triggering for them and different things about of that nature, in addition to what was happening in the world with the Black Lives Matter movement really kind of taking off. Our residents and students feeling some kind of way about the amount of officer involved shootings involving unarmed black men and different things of that nature. And that really started to hit close to home when we had an incident that occurred in Charlotte. And so those events happening outside the university, in addition to events happening at the university, really promoted us to really start to think about, like, are we really providing the best community that we can at NC State, and really look at if we aren't providing the best environment for especially all of our students, but what we found is that we weren't providing the best environment for our students from marginalized identities. Then we wanted to look at why was that the case, and hopefully identify some ways to change that for our students.
And part of the reason that CJ and I decided that we felt it was a good thing to have at CHO, especially as we think about the conversation, is so many of our mission statements, and NC State being included in that, is developing inclusive communities is such an integral part of what we say we want to do. But oftentimes not, it's used more as a colloquialism, or as like, wouldn't it be nice, without really looking at it from that critical perspective of how is it that we're actually doing it, and are we just saying that because it makes us feel better about what we're doing, and are students actually seeing the benefit of that work and what we're trying to do. So that's really the lens of which we developed this presentation, and so you'll hear kind of that throughout the course of our conversation today. So one of the things, I recognize that it's hard to read, but just to walk through this, so through the Sense of Community Index that CJ was saying was done in 2016, the results of that showed us that primarily three identity groups, so being sexual orientation, gender, specifically trans-identified students, and the category of race and ethnicity, but specifically our students of color, felt statistically significant difference in the sense of community that they felt compared to their majority identity group for each of those identities. Being that for all of the statements that are highlighted here, that they felt statistically significant less connection in community as a result of their identity. So in the survey, students were asked to identify what community it is they're talking about. So if it's talking about their village, when they hear community, what is it that they think of? Is it their floor or their apartment? Is it a village that they're a part of? Is it their specific building? There's a lot of different ways that we would classify it, but asking students to share with us, what of these categories do you identify with? And then from there, the survey is themed around, when you think of your community, so when you think of your village, answer these questions. And so a lot of that is in relation to how connected do you feel with your peers around you? Do you feel like you can trust those people, et cetera? So what we were seeing and what we wanted to highlight from the survey really briefly is just that the questions here were the ones that had the most statistical significance in variance for our marginalized identities that are highlighted above. So thinking about trust, students feeling that they can't trust the people in their community and space around them, right? And so thinking applicability wise, right? What does that mean that significantly fewer of our trans students don't feel like they can trust anybody in the spaces around them, right? Like that's really jarring. And so when I also highlighted in here, when I have a problem, I can talk about it with members of our community. And so recognizing like that's an integral part of what we want our RAs to be doing. And if we have students of minoritized sexual orientation identities, racial identities, et cetera, that can't talk with other people, whether it's peer-to-peer, from student to student or from student to RA, there's a problem with what's happening in our spaces. And so these were really, the reason why we wanted to incorporate these here is because these statements that were in our SCI2 results, again, this is where we saw the most discrepancy between marginalized and the students with majority identities. These really shaped where we developed our questions from when we progressed into doing focus groups. So that's part of the reason why we wanted to make sure to talk about them with you all.
Yeah, and it really became apparent of kind of what we were dealing with. I don't know that I would describe it as interesting, because for me, as somebody who within my job, I work with a lot of marginalized student populations or live and learning initiatives that really support those groups, right? To see that these students, like when we got to the focus group stage, like had this sense of comfort in terms of like, really now I finally have an environment where I can come and kind of talk about some of the struggles that I deal with on a day-to-day basis. It was good that we were finding some of this stuff out, but it was kind of just like, how do we create more spaces like this and different things like that for these students to feel comfortable? So this is one of our first quotes that we want to share from a student who participated in the LGBT QIA group. So we divided the groups up. The focus groups up by LGBT, QIA, and students of color. And so understanding that in some of those groups there was going to be some intersecting identities, so you definitely had some folks who came to the students of color group that identified with the LGBT group, and they kind of shared those experiences as well. But this is one of the quotes that that they shared during the focus group. I do feel like I would make some of the RAs comfortable if I came out to them. They are all very nice when I see them, but I mean, they seem uncomfortable just asking about school and not even anything personal, right? So we were making a transition to a residential curriculum where one-on-one conversations with residents was an expectation of our department, and so this student obviously didn't feel comfortable talking with their RA about, their personal identity issues and different things like that they were navigating, or didn't feel like it was a comfortable environment. So, and kind of reading this quote, it really prompted us to really start thinking about how do we better prepare our RAs, how do we be more intentional about how we using staff meeting time and training time and different things like this to create a closer and better sense of community for our students.
So we, after we got the results from the SCI2 survey, we decided that we were going to, and we reported to the university that we were going to do it, so we were definitely going to do it. But we decided that we were going to do focus groups to really dig into understanding why these specific identities were not feeling that same sense of connectedness as our other students were. And so part of this, at the time we had somebody, at NC State, we have a position dedicated to assessment initiatives in our department. The person who was previously in that position left and took a job elsewhere, and so at the time that was a vacancy, which has now since been filled. But we wanted to continue to persevere in doing the focus groups, and so this was just a couple of months after I started in my position, and our assistant directors got together for our assessment committee meeting and said, "Who wants to take this on?" And I was like, "All right, looks like it's me." So I was able to kind of spearhead that charge as the department as the new person. So even though I wasn't present for when the survey was actually distributed, I was there when we got the final results and really dissecting what it is that we were going to do with that information and how we wanted to best kind of shape this and logistically set it up. So developing questions. So we showed you, as I mentioned a moment ago, that we got the raw numbers in terms of where we saw the most variance in where our students aren't feeling connected, and so much of that is peer-to-peer relationships, including our student staff in that, and so really wanted to get a better sense. So pulling those that saw the most variance based off of identities, developed questions that, as you'll see in the next slide, focus around inclusion, exclusion, the idea of trust, and care for each other. So how do students, and these are really hard questions, but how do you show somebody that you care for them? What is it that you do to show somebody that they can trust you? And those are, we think we have it, and we talk about how we value trust as a quality, but to ask students, I mean, as an adult, that would be hard to describe how somebody shows that I can trust them. So really trying to spend some time, because they identified these are the areas that we're really struggling with on your campus. So really spending the time there because that's where they told us it mattered. And one of the things I do want to make sure that I note, and this kind of tied with the logistical piece, and so recognizing that we had very lengthy and very purposeful conversations about the fact that LGB and trans are two very different student populations and have very different needs. But as we think about the students who would be willing and interested in participating in our focus groups, of not trying to have our trans students feel isolated because there's just one or two who participate in the focus groups, and so intentionally, and talked with them about it, about why we decided to do a kind of all-encompassing LGBTQIA one, as opposed to setting it up as the rest of our data showed us, which was sexual orientation and trans as two separate. So I just want to make note of the fact that that was a very lengthy conversation. That what does the message send if we combine it, but what does it mean if we separate it and only have one or two, which is not the true format of a focus group, right? So instead of keeping kind of that true format. So we advertised it to all of our on-campus students. So we house just under 10,000, right, or between 9 and 10,000 students on campus. And so advertised it to everyone, and we were very upfront about what it is we were doing. So we asked students to self-identify if they identify either as a student of color or somebody of the LGBTQIA community. And said, we want to do this focus group, and we're going to give you dinner and a gift card if you come talk to us about what your experiences was like. And we told them up front, we want to talk about what your experience on campus in university housing was going to be like. So we really, from the beginning, set the stage of here are the parameters of what we want the conversation to be like, and continue that on every step of the way with communication. So we did get the approval to incentivize it and use some gift cards to be able to encourage folks to come and participate. And they got the gift cards after the fact and all of that. So honestly, we were very nervous about what it was going to look like, but did decide, because our returning students were the ones who had participated or had the opportunity to participate in the index survey. So we decided to break it out between new students who had not done that survey yet and our returning students who had the opportunity to do that survey. So we actually ended up, we were planning on having 4, so new and returning for each of the 2 identity groups, and ended up total having 6 different focus groups because we had such large turnout response from our students who said they want to tell us their experience, which we are very grateful for. So total, we had about 80 students that decided that they wanted to participate in our focus groups, which was pretty great, and also required buying more gift cards. But so we split it up. We decided that all of our facilitators were going to be assistant director level or above. And so it was one, and we had conversations as well about what does it mean to have a facilitator who may or may not hold that identity of how are we shaping the space by the facilitators that we're inviting into there too. And we talked with that. We talked about it in our group, but we also talked about it with the students as well. And so we encourage things like sharing your pronouns and talking about what does that mean for me as a cisgender white woman to come into a space with LGBTQIA students. So we talked about that in our group as we were planning the logistics pieces, but also talked about it with the students so that they knew what type of perspective we were coming from. Even though we were just the facilitator asking the question, we weren't responding back to them, but also just recognizing the power and influence that we have in those spaces.
Yeah, so I mean, I think something to add on to that too is that so we also invited our community director staff to kind of come in and take notes and different things like that. If it was anything that they were observing and different things like that, I think it's very emotional. I think it's very important that during these situations when our students are talking about things that could potentially be very painful to them, to have additional professional staff there just in case somebody needs to leave a room, just so that we have somebody there to kind of check in with a student and make sure that they were good to go. And so that was a piece of it that we did offer as well. Before we even got into the focus groups, one of the things that we tried to do is reach out to our campus partners in the Office of Institutional Equity and Diversity to share with them the questions that we had generated, right, in hopes of getting feedback in terms of like, yo, I wouldn't term it this way. I wouldn't use this language. I would recommend using this and different things like that. So we very much took a approach of utilizing our knowledge and passion, which is very high. I feel like we were all very competent individuals, but also looking at utilizing our campus partners who this is what they do all day, every day, right, to assist us in closing the gaps where we might not have recognized as well. All right, so as Meghan shared, this is the flow of how the focus group went. So when the students came to participate in the focus group, we had them start off by introducing themselves. They said their names and their number that they were given. And so the introduction was the only part of the focus group where they were asked to say their name. That information was more so just for our internal purposes and wasn't utilized for research purposes. So they shared their name and their number, and then every time they spoke after that, they just said their number and then they said what they had to say. We spent some time talking about what does inclusion look like, what does exclusion look like, what does trust look like, and what does care for each other look like, and then kind of just wrapping up, giving them an opportunity to kind of share whatever it is that they wanted to share. In the inclusion and exclusion piece of it, we gave students an opportunity to really talk about what are offices on campus and areas of campus where they either feel inclusion or feel exclusion. And so some of those places that they mentioned were places that you would be expecting to hear. So like a multicultural student affairs office, African American Cultural Center, the LGBT office, and different things like that. But one of the things that is unique about our campus is that even though those offices are in play, those offices are very much out in the open, right? So if I'm going through some and say, for instance, like I don't want anybody to see me going into those offices are in very public places with glass, so everybody can see who's in them. And so some of the students talked about their reluctancy to utilize even those services, just for the simple fact that they were going through whatever they were going through, and they didn't want a whole lot of publicity and going through that.
So one of the questions that we asked in the exclusion section was, tell us about a time that you felt excluded from the community. And so what we did was highlighted, so this was a response from one of our returning students who's a student of color in that focus group. It said, I had to do my hair in the bathroom, so it was like a public area. I remember it was like 3 a.m. and I was still doing my hair. My RA came in there and was like, oh, you're still in here. I said, it takes a really long time. And she was like, well, a lot of people are complaining about the noise. Is there anything you can do to speed up this process or finish tomorrow? And so talking about how, as we continue to think about the training that we're providing for our student staff, understanding microaggressions, understanding the needs of our residents are different for a lot of different reasons, and you may not understand or have experienced all of those, but for this student, that totally diminished the relationship that they were willing to have with the RA. And so helping our RAs understand that you can microaggress somebody one time, and that's the end of your ability to try and build a relationship with them. So doing and trying to implement any of the pieces of the residential curriculum were not going to happen with that resident, because you have burned the bridge of that relationship. And so really of using these types of these stories, which ideally would be to keep them from happening in the future, right? So as we think about the cultural sensitivity of our student staff members, but that our RAs understand the importance of trying to develop relationships with people who are different from them and have different needs from them. And so wanted to make sure, and this will come up as we talk a little bit about the implications, but through and through, I mean, we did have some students that were like, yeah, I mean, generally things are pretty good. And to be honest, that was mostly, if that came up, that was from our new students who had been with us for about a semester. In every single one of our returning student focus groups, there were numerous examples of ways that specifically our staff had kept them from feeling included in the spaces. So, which drove a lot of the recommendations that we had for moving forward. So in making sense of the data, just really briefly, some of the logistical pieces. And so if you're thinking about how potentially implementing some focus groups on your campus, one of the things that we wanted to highlight that we did, so we did do audio recording. There were several parts throughout the process. We worked with our Office for Assessment for our campus. They did a review of our questions in advance, but they also, we borrowed some audio recording devices from them in order to do some audio recording, which is where the numbers came in. So being able to hear resident one, we knew that there was a change in speaker and somebody else bringing conversation to the space. So at the time, we didn't have access to transcription, a company to be able to transcribe the audio recordings for us. So that's not great. If you have access to it, I strongly recommend it. And that may be something that your university as a whole may have access to, maybe through the library or some research or assessment office. At the time, that was not the case. And so our new coordinator for assessment in our department does have access. And so since then, we've been able to get transcriptions of our focus groups. But use your resources. And at the time, our people were our resources. So all the assistant directors got together and we spent time listening. So we sat together in somebody's office and we broke it up because that would have been a long couple of days. But we broke it up into a couple of days and we just spent time listening to what the person said. And to be honest, there were times that we had to pause it and say, did you hear what that person just said? And really try to unpack, because there's a difference between hearing what that person said and hearing what we want them to, or what we want to hear. And so really there would be times that we would pause it and say, what do we think that this person meant? And so I heard it one way, CJ heard it another way, and so we would have to go back, rewind it, and go back to kind of set the stage for the context of the conversation a little bit more to truly hear the words of what our students were saying so that we could at the time accurately reflect that. And then from there, what we did is we pulled themes and the thematic information from those, which we'll talk a little bit about in the implications, but really pulling the themes out, because ultimately that's what we were going to use to recommend for changes. And as a note, since then, our new coordinator for assessment has done the transcription and all of that, and we were pretty on the nose with it. She was like, I didn't find any extra. I was like, good. I felt really good about that, y'all. Yes, and she's like does like her PhD work in sociology, so I felt really good about myself that day when she told us. But so know that even if you don't have access to a software that can do transcription, even doing a thematic review, it does take time, but not having just one person in the space listening to that information, but you can listen to that information and pull out the themes from what our students are saying under each of the areas of inclusion, exclusion, et cetera, or whatever those areas you identify, and be able to still pull applicable data from what the students are telling you, even if you don't have the direct transcription from that.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that's important to note is is that as we were going through this process, like, we had to admit that we didn't meet the mark, right? We didn't support our students, and so, like, while that was kind of like a downer to really see and have to acknowledge, the suggestions and what came out as a result of that, I think we have our heads held high about that and are really proud of utilizing some of the things and opportunities that we have the opportunity to have at NC State to really improve the experience for our students on campus. So these were some of the areas that we felt like we needed to address. These were some of the things the areas that, based off of the themes that we seen, where we felt like we could do better, right? So recruitment was the first thing, right? In the student of color focus group that I did, a lot of the students talked about not seeing people who look like them in the positions that they needed to go to for help, right? And so we began to really think about, like, how do we better recruit for our student staff positions? Instead of expecting students to come to us, how do we set up branches and connections to take the information about our positions to groups that do represent these underrepresented students and different things like that, to really make our recruitment pool bigger and better. And staff training, we spent intentional time focusing on microaggressions, building community with underrepresented student populations, and a variety of other different socioeconomic status, and a variety of other different things and during student staff training, right? But now, as our diversity committee is really kicked back up too, we are thinking about how do we also offer these resources ongoing throughout the year, not only to our student staff, but our professional staff as well, who may not be comfortable having these conversations with some of our students. We also looked at housing processes. A lot of students talked about, how unintentionally the housing process of filling out an application made them feel included or excluded, right? And so, we submitted a report to our director at that time, and worked with our associate director for housing assignments and guest operations to really look at like how can we better offer up opportunities for students to feel included and not so excluded in the housing process as well.
And just to highlight an example of that, so we had several students. So one of the focus groups I did was the LGBTQIA new student process. And so hearing students talk about what it felt like to be trans-identified in the state of North Carolina is challenging. The laws keep us bound in certain ways already. But so what it felt like to be told as a trans student, your option is a single, which there are other options, but most of them are single by way of single as in true single, by yourself or an apartment complex. But so here's a single that you can live in, but you've got to pay a single rate for that. So it's like having to pay more. So the connection between, as we talk about intersecting identities, if you have to pay more as a result of having a marginalized identity. So that was an example of one of the housing processes that we shared about, like here's the real person relationship that was impacted. Here's the person that was impacted by the process that we may or may not have considered at that point. So yes, so the pieces that we include in here as well, so student voice. And so as we mentioned earlier, of thinking about ways that your students feel like they're given capacity, and recognizing the importance. And so as CJ said, we were recognizing the areas that we had really missed the mark, both in training and recruitment of our student staff, but also in the ways that we were building and developing our curriculum and thinking about the experiences we wanted for our residents. And a lot of that being, it's really great to sit around in a space and ideate as professionals, but when student voice isn't a part of that space, this is when you come to the realization that you've got student voices and student identities that weren't being considered and were being negatively impacted. And so as a consideration for you all of thinking about the way that you are able to give student voice capacity in some of your processes as a department or whatever your sphere of control or sphere of influence is, but recognizing that the policies, we can advocate to a certain degree, but often it's going to be as a result of students making us aware of those discrepancies. It's not always from our lens that we're able to identify those. Sometimes it is, but most of the time it's not. So I think for a lot of us, it really kind of gave us a good gut check in terms of ways that we were or were not giving students capacity in that way. And that was really kind of one of the first times, at least that I know of, that our students really had the ability to really give us some critical feedback in this type of setting. So our educational strategies, we talked a little bit about how we have a residential curriculum. For us, it's called Experience and Engage. And so thinking about what educational strategies are being implemented in our communities and what our partnerships with our campus partners around campus look like to bring that content expertise into the spaces. And so that's an ongoing conversation with any campus that is implementing a residential curriculum, but thinking critically about oftentimes some of the educational strategies that we incorporate are based off of the passion areas of our staff, and that's important and that's valuable, but also is limited in and of itself. And so thinking about if you're highlighting certain types of identities through bulletin boards and through programming, are there identities that are not a part of the conversation that aren't getting that same type of educational presence within the residence halls and within the community spaces? And then the last one, so in higher education, I think we talk a lot about the idea and concept of brave and safe spaces because, again, I think it makes us feel really good to talk about those things. But again, as we think about the way that our verbiage really impacts the student experience, for me, I personally feel very challenged by the idea of brave and safe spaces because that often results in students of majority identities trying to feel a little bit better about being in that space. And so feeling the need to feel brave in a space when it's just you're feeling uncomfortable. And so really speaking power and having our students better understand that the power in your words. And so there's a different level of sense of safety in our society for me as a white woman versus CJ as a man of color, right? And so the idea of safety is inherently different. And so to try to adapt that for me as a white woman to say that I need a safe space. Most of the United States is a safe space for me. And so recognizing the way that the lingo that we use is impacting what our students are hearing, I feel very challenged by. And so that came up in our conversations when students would say, well, I need a safe space for this to happen. And so of really recognizing is, as CJ alluded to a few minutes ago, of do we need to create private spaces for folks of marginalized identities to be able to truly feel safe, because elsewhere in our society, and including our campuses, they may feel unsafe otherwise. And really trying to dissect the difference between where's bravery coming into that, especially for folks who are of majority identities, versus folks who feel unsafe in general America, that really are trying to find a space that can be with other people that are facing some similar struggles as they are. So that's something that, again, we spend a lot of time talking about the nuance between brave and space, and what the impact is when you have kind of a blend of folks and blend of identities in one space together. But I think ultimately to summarize that point of using the words that we mean and saying what we mean in that way as well. And oftentimes those two get conflated between the two, so.
Cool. So kind of just like what I was alluding to earlier, this is another, it looked familiar too. I think it was in my focus group. So one of our students of color mentioned, I wish there was more progress to have more people that look like us as mentors and RDs in the dorm, because you go through the doors and you see a bunch of people not of color and everything. So you're just like, who do I talk to? Who do I go to for help? And so that's a very real thing. I can definitely remember like me coming to undergrad at the University of Wisconsin Parkside in 2004. Right, I walked through the doors and I felt that sense of home because I did see people that looked like me. And so like when I began to struggle, there were people who reached out to me and people that I did feel comfortable to. But this is the reality for some of our students. And so even if it's not possible to like really be able to, every single time they walk into the hall, they see somebody that look like them, at the very least we can do our due diligence to make sure that the staff that is greeting them is competent and skilled enough to be able to address their needs, right? And so definitely continuing to diversify our student staff will be an ongoing thing that we'll be striving to do. But I think that we can take immediate action into making sure that we are investing the time necessary to make sure that we have a multicultural, competent group of student staff members as much as we can, because we obviously don't have control over people's thoughts and feelings and different things like that, but we do have control over the expectations that we create in terms of how we want our student staff to make our residents feel, regardless of the identities that they bring into our residence halls.
So we talked a little bit about the implications, and as we've been kind of going through, and our department has continued to see some staffing changes, and we recently, our assistant director for recruitment, selection, and training, so they oversee all of those processes for us, recently left. And so as we have been re-envisioning what some of these processes are, we keep coming back to what is the information, what's the data that we got from our focus groups, and how can we use it. So like CJ was just talking about, thinking about our recruitment processes of all levels of staff, and training for all levels of staff. So last year, we started by implementing and incorporating our focus group data from our community director trainings all the way through RA training. So we did everything from presenting the data to our colleagues in the department, incorporating the rotating sessions like CJ said with the RAs, right? We didn't present to the RAs, here's the data we found about ways that you're bad at your job and how you're making things terrible, right? What we did was poll that we had a session around microaggressions, and they went through. CJ did mention that we did socioeconomic status, and in case you were wondering, that was connected to our common read this year. So if you're like, that was not one of the identities you highlighted, that's why. So our common read was about socioeconomic and food insecurity, and so tying in a university initiative into that as we're talking about our general understanding and recognizing the intersectionality that comes with socioeconomic status and so many identities that we were talking about. So we continue to identify ways in those areas that we just talked about for ways that we can apply the data, but most importantly, coming back to it, and as new staff come in, making sure that they're aware that data like this exists in our department. So it really is kind of an ongoing, and even at CHO, I've been thinking it's kind of re-triggered some ideas of ways that we can continue to implement some new training, some new initiatives, ways to continue the conversation, because the idea, it's not stagnant. Developing inclusive communities is never something that you've arrived at, but it's definitely things that you could backpedal on, and that's what we really don't want to happen. But as we think, just speaking to the closing the assessment loop of just being mindful of, and I would be remiss, my friends over in the Office of Assessment would be upset if they didn't share it. And in transparency, my partner works in that office and would be really upset if I didn't say close the assessment loop. And so share with students, if you have students that are involved in your assessment process, of sharing with them what we found out. And so at the end, we talked with them. We said, it's going to take us a little bit of time. We did this right after spring break. And so we said, it's probably going to be like the end of the summer, because we got a lot going on, and we got to listen to everything and pull out all the information. So writing the executive summary to be able to share with folks and share that information out, and recognizing your stakeholders, and those include the students who participate in that, but sharing back with them, thank you so much. Not only do we value it by way of giving you food and a gift card, but we also value it and want to share with you, here's what we found as a result of your participation from this focus group. So thinking about ways that you can continue to incorporate them in that process. And so, as we mentioned earlier, understanding engagement from the lens of your underrepresented students. I think the context around collecting assessment data is really important, both in the collection of it, but also in the delivery of it, of thinking about, and again, we talk about what had been happening on our campus, and all of those students in our returning groups had already had an opportunity to share with us their sense of community and what they felt like they were or were not getting in the survey, but these are students who wanted to go an extra step to be able to tell us in person what their experiences were like. And so thinking about, like, our returning students, they came in with stuff to say, and I'm so grateful that they did. And our new students, like I said, they had a little less longevity with us, and so not to say that that data wasn't as rich, but there were not as many kind of pointed examples as the conversations with our returning students. So I think understanding the context, and if you're looking at specifically the experience of your underrepresented students, some of that may mean you as a staff member being aware of what's happening societally, culturally, that's impacting the experience they're having on your campus, because so many of those factors are impacting how they're moving in and out of campus and out of spaces on a daily basis.
Yeah, and I think that that's important to really start to reflect on so how does your department and campus help keep your professional staff aware of what's going on in the community? What kind of best practices do you all have? Where are the gaps in terms of where you can improve? We kind of shared what we have kind of reflected on and learned from our students. The reality is that this is happening in most campuses and universities, and I think that we can all continue to improve as our society continues to evolve and change, and our student needs begin to change. Our student needs this year are not going to be the same as they will be next year, and so we have to be evolving and changing with them as well. So using this data to really critique a lot of our processes, looking at some of our committees, and really thinking about how do we better serve our students, right? So I'm the chair of the diversity committee at NC State, and so I'm very proud of kind of the work that the committee has done this year, because we are really doing the work to be able to kind of set up our student staff, our professional staff, as well as our students in terms of giving them an opportunity to grow and have a better experience on campus. And so, doing regular brown bag lunches, really being intentional about our cultural immersion trips that we offer for our students. That's one of the things that I love about NC State is that we definitely put the money and the resources in to creating these experiences for these students. Now we just have to do them, right? And so being very intentional about the work that we do every single day and taking advantage of every opportunity that we have to make the on-campus living experience better for our students.
And then our final set of quotes, they're similar, so we paired them together on one. So these are both from LGBTQIA new students. So the first says, the first time I got an email from University Housing with somebody's pronouns on it, I screenshotted it, sent it to my friends, and was like, how cool is this? And then the next one says, one of the first things I did when I got here was to take a picture of the gender neutral sign on the bathroom on the first floor. I was just really happy about that. Right, so even as we think about, I refer to them as beacons of light. But so as we send our beacons of light to our students to indicate that I'm a safe person for you to come talk to, it's not just in our offices or on our doors, but it's also the signage in our halls and our email signatures and those types of things. And so even thinking critically about what are the ways that you're sending messages to students that you're a safe person to be able to come and talk to. And so something for you to think critically about, again, both in the spaces that you can control, but the second one, the gender neutral bathroom signs, that came from an initiative of one of our second year graduate students. And so even as a graduate student, really going through and looking very critically, and this is a person who's trans identified and really was very passionate about the importance of gender neutral spaces. And so across campus really worked in our residence halls to really promote changing out our single use bathrooms to have signage that reflected as gender neutral instead, and signage that shows respect for all people instead of just in the gender binary. So I say that to say that recognizing every campus is different, and but even on a variety of levels, like I said, that was a graduate student who really took up that call to action because it was something that they felt very strongly about, and our campus is a little bit better for it. So finding those opportunities, because to have a student on the back end say, like, this is something that made me knew I would feel included here, I think is a great testament to those types of initiatives and ways that we can show some recognition for our sphere of control, our sphere of influence. So yeah. What questions can we answer for you? Yeah.
You all talked about the recruitment and how you needed to look how to recruit different groups of underrepresented students. I'm wondering if that's something you all have started and what that looks like.
Yeah. That's a great question. So our recruitment process happens in the fall. So for us, it's a little bit sooner because they take a class in the spring semester. And so we are in the process of making some adjustments for our professional staff. One of the big things that we're planning on adjusting for next year are the places we do info sessions. They're required to go to an info session before they can do an interview, but of changing the locations of where they are. So in years past, they've been only in our residence halls, only in our residence halls. And so going to actually meet students where they are, right? So CJ mentioned, so our African American Cultural Center is in one location, which is separate from our Multicultural Student Association, our Women's Center, and our GLBT Center, but of using the physical space that exists as a resource, right? If that's where our students, especially students of underrepresented identities, are hanging out, then at least being in the student union where those centers exist is a missed opportunity for us. So shifting where some of our info sessions are taking place to be in closer proximity to where students of those identities, it's easier for them. They don't have to pick between going to an identity-based center or coming to a residence hall for an info session. So that's at least one of the pieces. I'll let you take over from there.
Yeah, I think that's accurate. I think also just kind of being like thinking a little bit more about what our process looks like, right? We are currently in the process of looking. What we currently do is we have interviews So our candidates who apply for the RA position submit an application. Their application is scored, right, and then we offer interviews to all of those applicants, right. And so the interview is the only time that we are really able to kind of see them throughout the process. Now, we know that depending on the person and different things like that, the interviews are not always a comfortable way, nor do they always give you, nor do like the physical, like me sitting across from two people interview, really give you the best information in terms of how somebody will be successful in a role. And so we are currently in the process of looking at, how can we remove the bias, more bias from our process, as well as look at other opportunities, like maybe like a group process or something like that, to give people an opportunity to like really showcase other skills and abilities that they have, because some people shine in different ways. Like me, I wasn't the best interviewer, but you put me in a group process, even though I'm an introvert, and my strengths shine and flourish. So yeah.
What were other demographic variables that were available through the campus community index that didn't show any variability on your campus?
So we looked at, I mentioned that we had the community breakdowns. Sorry, I forgot for a minute there. So, I mean, obviously we were able to break it down demographically by way of where they live on campus. So I mentioned I'm over university apartments. And so mine is the only set of communities that it is different from the rest of our campus, right? So we didn't see a whole lot of variance in terms of community style. I mean, really, they collected all demographic information from our students, and because some of that was tied with what they reported on their housing application. So I mean, that gave us age information, veteran status, and that came up, I would say, maybe one or two times. There was like so the list of statements that we had, there was maybe one or two statements that had some statistical significance in difference, but they collected that one. Are there others that you remember? Gender, as in gender in terms of a gender binary, male and female. That was one that we talked about a lot as well. And when we talk about the race and ethnicity piece earlier too, we did have it so specific as to include if they were Hispanic identified, Black, et cetera. So if there were other racial breakdowns, it wasn't just students of color or white. So we did have the demographic breakdown between different identities. So we were able to also look at some of the variance in there, obviously, which there was some for Asian identified versus Hispanic versus Black, et cetera. So we had, basically, if you think of all the like basic demographic questions, we were able to sort through those.
I was just wondering,
Yeah.
there's some populations on our campus that I think probably, if there was a demographic indicator in the survey,
Yeah.
would probably pop up. Like for us, very conservative students
Right.
report feeling very marginalized in our communities.
Yeah.
And then like some of our international students do as well.
Yeah, one of the other things that we realized too is that even though like we picked these groups out, we identified these groups to like really pull some additional information from via the focus groups. There are some of our communities on campus that actually do well in supporting these groups, right? So one of them in my area is Avon Ferry. Avon Ferry is traditionally known for being a place where we have a lot of the large student of color population in that community, and so it's a very vibrant community, so much so that like people come from on campus to Avon Ferry to kind of hang out, because that's where a lot of their friends are and different things like that. So like some of these trends that we were seeing, like definitely wasn't like across the board. Like as you just started to drill down in the specific residential hall populations, you started to find like different variances and different things of that nature.
But we didn't ask folks to report, and I'm not 100% sure if you can amend it to ask about political affiliation or those types of things. But I know that that's not something we collect at least.
Yeah.
I know you both spoke a little bit to how you would want the data to inform your educational
Yeah, that's a great question. So my population, I serve kind of the smorgasbord of students, and I love it. And so one of the ways that we have really worked on, so our curriculum is, we house primarily first-year students, and so our curriculum reflects that. So our current curriculum is based on the first-year experience and doesn't incorporate upper-class students or in the apartments. That ranges from first-year student athletes who live in my community, international students, families, staff. I've got them all. I say all of that to say this past summer, as we talked about making modifications and all of that, so one of the things that I implemented in my area was really spending time, and some of this is also teaching our entry-level professionals about how to engage in research. And so we spend a lot of time every week engaging in the literature around our specialized populations. And so a lot of my community are international students and also graduate students. And so as we think about ways, so we're spending time reading what research tells us about the graduate student experience, about the international student experience, about students of color, and especially it's primarily a STEM institution, and so spending time reading about what does it mean to be a woman of color in STEM. And so as we think about what are the predominant identities that exist within our individual communities, because we do have such a variance across campus, of spending time reading what research already exists, not trying to duplicate efforts and all of that, right? To learn about what it is kind of more broadly research tells us that our students are needing and wanting. And really we've been shifting our message, right? So kind of across the board, one of the themes that I've seen in some of the minority identities that exist in my communities is that switching the language from come do this because it's going to be fun to here's the utility of this. Here's how this is going to be a beneficial experience for you. And that has really been something that's been really instrumental for all of us, right? A graduate student's not going to want to come and hang out just for the sake of getting some pizza, right? So let's talk about what is this going to do to further your academic commitment. And also when you're exhausted from working in a lab all day, here's a way that you can take some time for yourself, but also still engage with us as housing. So, that's really my biggest piece, is that really shifting the way that we're engaging with the research and literature, which also makes us better at our jobs because we're more well-versed in what faculty have to say and what faculty are hearing from students more broadly across the country about those experiences. Does that help answer your question? Do you have anything to add to that? Thank you. Other questions? Well, we would very kindly ask if you could, I'm doing the moderator job, but if you wouldn't mind please taking out your phones and doing your guidebook review for us, we would love the feedback. And if you want to engage any further about our process, or if you're looking at implementing either qualitative or quantitative research on your campus, or trying to figure out even within your own locus of control what that would look like, we'd be happy to talk with you about that.